There's three questions about consciousness.
Okay.
One is, what's the nature of consciousness? How does this weird non-physical thing exist in the physical universe? That's the, right? There's the function problem. What does consciousness do? Since you can do so much behavior as an intelligent zombie.
Right. Why not all of it?
Yeah, why not all of it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And then
because you do, well, the cerebellum is a good example of that, right? I think there's more neurons in the cerebellum than in the cortex.
Yeah.
And it's not conscious by any normal measures. So it's like, obviously consciousness isn't a mere consequence of neural activity.
No.
So much of that's unconscious. And then it does beg the question, if so much of it is unconscious, why not all of it? Okay, so two questions. So we've already put forward the hypothesis that the instinct for meaning is something like a marker for the proper expansion and organization of the category system, of the brain itself, and maybe even related to health. But then there's another interesting thing that Carhart Harris and people like him have been concentrating on, which is that the phenomenon of consciousness itself, which is being itself in some real sense, insofar as you have to be conscious of things for them to be, is like, I still don't understand how this gets us out of the so-called zombie problem. It's like, why is it that consciousness itself and this sense of being is associated with operation on this meaningful edge?
Okay.
Reification. Reification is from the Latin noun res rei, meaning thing, and the Latin verb facere, meaning to make. Hence, reification is literally to make something a thing. In modern usage, reification has diverse meanings in various contexts and disciplines. In the most general sense, reification can refer to the creation of a construct, a theoretical or explanatory model that is not in itself directly observable. Since we rely on such constructs to interpret reality, it's easy to commit the fallacy of reification, mistaking an abstract model for a real thing. For instance, the law of gravity is not an actual law or tangible force with its own will. Rather, it's a mere mathematical description, a model, of the concrete and observable relations between physical bodies and their attraction to one another. Confusing abstractions with things, or the map with the territory, is an instance of the fallacy of reification. This fallacy is especially pertinent in Marxist philosophy, where it's often observed that capitalist ideology often represents human-made constructs, like the market, as having agency, power, and significance independent of the real human lives that give it meaning. And it commits the complementary fallacy of turning human beings themselves into mere things, whose value can be quantified and equated with those of various commodities and products. This phenomenon of reification may in fact be exacerbated by our increased involvement in digital spaces, where value and self-worth are quantified in site-specific data points, likes, follows, views, and subscribers. Please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Let's make it a thing. Reification.
So let me just introduce this issue of the philosophical zombie. And it's telling that it was natural to philosophers and cognitive scientists to use the zombie as a way of talking about this. So one of the issues, of course, and we bumped up against this, we're going to bump up it again, is the issue of consciousness. And one of the things that is problematic about consciousness is why you have it and what does it do for you. Because first of all, most of your processing can be done unconsciously. In fact, most of your processing is being done unconsciously. Most of what's happening so that I can speak to you is not any process of which I am introspectively aware. My consciousness in no way penetrates to tell me what's going on such that I am being grammatical, such that I'm articulating, etc. All these things. When I'm remembering something, I don't know what I do to remember, I just remember. And so one of the great difficulties is, well, what is consciousness for? Now let me explain a phenomena for you to try and extend the possibility of how much you could be unconscious. And this is the phenomena of blind sight. By the way, I recommend the book by Peter Watts, a science fiction book on blind sight. It's one of the great science fiction novels dealing with encountering aliens that actually do not possess consciousness and what that might mean for us and how truly alien that would make them. So here's the phenomena of blind sight. A person has blind sight you bring them into a room and they are absolutely sincere, and so phenomenologically, experientially, they are blind. They cannot see. And there's all kinds of reasons for believing that they're being absolutely... So they are not having what we would call the experience of sight, right? And then what you could ask them to do is you bring them into a room and you say, okay, there's a bottle somewhere in this room, point to it, and they'll get angry. They'll say, what are you doing? You're being cruel. And you say, just trust me, point to it. And they'll say, okay, I guess a bottle's there, and they point to a bottle. There's even been experiments where you can change the orientation of the object, and they can guess the orientation. It can be that quite precise. Now here's the interesting possibility, right? So what's going on here is you have what we might call a lot of the intelligence of sight, the ability to, detect, not experience. I'm trying to pull these apart, but detect and pick up and potentially interact with objects in a very efficacious manner without there being any experiential component to it. So does that make sense? Blind sight?
Yes.
Okay, so now let's consider that we have a creature that had not only blind sight but deaf hearing. And notice how that might strike you as a contradiction, but it's no more of a contradiction than this, right? So that their ears can do all kinds of detecting of air disruption, but they have none of the experience of hearing. They have numb touch, right? So there's none of the feeling of contact, but nevertheless, all the mechanics and all the intelligible interactions, presumably. Now, put these two together. Pay attention to this. You've been driving down the highway for the last 15 minutes and you realize, I haven't been paying attention at all. Right? And in fact, in some of the literature, people talk about this.
It's a lot.
People talk about this as their inner zombie.
That's right.
So there was something in them that was successfully driving, but it was not the part of them that was having the conscious experience. So take that capacity to have this intelligent interaction, and then imagine that creature has blind sight, deaf hearing, and numb touch. So here's the thought experiment, right? I get a creature that acts as well as you do. It can move around the environment, right, in this completely sophisticated fashion. It could drive a car down a highway, right? It's doing all of this, but it's doing it completely through blind sight, deaf hearing, and numb. It is completely lacking in consciousness. It has no conscious ability. Now, whether or not such a creature is philosophically possible, right, that's part of the dispute. That's not at issue here. I would argue that ultimately I don't think it is, but that'll come later.
Yeah.
All we need for our purposes is this creature that is completely lacking in consciousness, completely lacking in perspectival knowing, was, without hesitation, I think without any thought, was referred to by many philosophers spontaneously as a zombie.
Yeah.
And then they would also often call it a philosophical zombie because they wanted to bring out this particular thought experiment. So the whole issue of consciousness and our somewhat insecurity, our metaphysical insecurity, like what is consciousness? What place does it have, right? It's the locus for so much of my identity and who I am and meaning, but how does it fit into the scientific worldview? All of that, right, insecurity is wrapped up in the possibility, right, that we might not need consciousness at all.
Right.
And so the zombie, the fact that it was called a philosophical zombie, again, the zombie idea points towards this insecurity, this kind of potential loss, the threat we're feeling, and the complete lack of perspective and perspectival knowing.
The psychedelic experience definitely mimics something like radical learning. And it also seems to reduce the effect of memory on perception. Because most of what you see in the world is memory. It's just that's why, when you look at a word, printed word, you read the word. You can't not read the word. And that's because you see in the memory. You're not seeing, like when I look at the sign behind you, I'm not lost in the yellow in the details. I see the Joe Rogan experience, right? It's part and parcel of the perception. It's all memory.
Apple, boot, mom, peace,
Today, I'm thrilled to be sharing with you some tips and tricks for helping your young children get ready to learn, ready to read, and ready to be successful in school. Our video today is going to focus on a technique called dialogic reading, which is a really unique way to enhance your child's reading abilities so that they're ready to meet those grade level standards later on. And it's just by asking a few simple questions. Dialogic reading is a method of shared book reading where adults and children have a dialogue or a back and forth conversation about the book. The goal is for your child to become the storyteller and for you to be the listener. And what you want is to connect the language and experiences of your child with the experiences that your child is reading in the book.
We're gonna read the three
little piggies.
That's right, the three little pigs. Good job. All right. Do you remember this story?
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, I'm excited to read it today. Are you?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the benefits of dialogic reading are first that your child learns about the rules of reading and writing, like how words move across the page from left to right and top to bottom. In dialogic reading, your child is also working on a key and critical skill for their later reading comprehension, and that's language and vocabulary. So by reading the words and asking these questions that we're going to teach you about today, this will help to enhance your child's vocabulary that they need to be successful in reading later on.
So, here's the thought experiment, right? I get a creature that acts as well as you do. It can move around the environment, right, in this completely sophisticated fashion. It could drive a car down a highway, right? It's doing all of this, but it's doing it completely through blind sight, deaf hearing, and numb. It is completely lacking in consciousness. It has no conscious ability. Now, whether or not such a creature is philosophically possible, right, that's part of the dispute. That's not at issue here. I would argue that ultimately I don't think it is, but that'll come later. Yeah. All we need for our purposes is this creature that is completely lacking in consciousness, completely lacking in perspectival knowing.
What do you think about those scholars in Israel that believe that the burning bush was some sort of a psychedelic experience?
Oh, well, I think we have no idea how psychedelic experience shaped religious presumption.
Have you read Brian Murarescu's
Yeah, absolutely.
work? Yeah.
I interviewed him. Oh, yeah.
Amazing.
I mean, look, we know that the shamanic tradition, which is God only knows how many tens of thousands of years old, it might be, is it millions of years old? Maybe. Human beings have been using fire for 2 million years. It could be really, really old. And the shamanic tradition is definitely a psychedelic tradition. And one of the things Murarescu did was show quite clearly that all of Greek culture was embedded in what looks like a collective psychedelic experience. And so, yeah, I think the evidence, like Mircea Eliade, a great religious scholar, studied shamanism, and he thought that the use of psychedelics was a degeneration of the original tradition, but I don't think that's true at all. I think that the psychedelic tradition is part and parcel of the universal religious heritage of mankind, and I don't know what that means. I've talked to people like Robin Carhart Harris, who studies the neurology of psychedelic experience, and he said that what it does is produce something akin to a hyper stress experience. So imagine you're extremely stressed, like your life's in danger. And so you have to open yourself up to the possibility of radically new ideas. Well, a psychedelic substance puts you in that state of mind. And so that can be hellish because you can collapse into like a catastrophic fight or flight defensive response and magnified by the hallucinogen, then you're just in hell. But that isn't the only necessary outcome. And so the psychedelic experience definitely mimics something like radical learning. And it also seems to reduce the effect of memory on perception. Because most of what you see in the world is memory. It's just a short, that's why, when you look at a word, printed word, you read the word. You can't not read the word. And that's because you see in the memory. You're not seeing, like when I look at the sign behind you, I'm not lost in the yellow and the details. I see the Joe Rogan experience, right? It's part and parcel of the perception. It's all memory. What a psychedelic does in part is remove the inhibition of memory from perception. And that re-immerses you in the complex world and shows you how remarkable and beyond comprehension everything really is. That's real. But the question is what to do with that. Timothy Leary, his doctrine was turn on, tune in, drop out. And that devastated the whole culture, that idea. It's like, well, if we just shed our presuppositions and the whole industrial nightmare, we'd all be freedom-loving hippies wandering around in Eden. It's like, no. I wanted to do a line of psychedelic products. Turn on, tune in, grow up. Right. I think that's much funnier, much better.
Yeah, and that's also possible. That's a possible path through this sort of quest for spiritual enlightenment.
Yeah.
And it's not, the Timothy Leary thing was, it was dismissed by a lot of other psychedelic pioneers of the time. They saw the flaws in that thinking.
Yeah, definitely. The people who were already experimenting with ideas of proper set,
and also
they knew that back in the early 60s.
Yes. And also the people that had no desire to run a group of like-minded people, which Leary did. Which he wanted to.
He fell into that hippie culture, that hippie counterculture.
He also, I think he fell into the cult of personality. He fell into this thing that happens when too many people are paying attention to you.
Yeah.
And you think you have all the answers.
Yeah.
It's very dangerous.
Yeah, especially if you combine that with psychedelic experience.
Yes.
That turns out to be a problem.
Right, and the intoxicating grip of that, the power that you have over these people, which is it's unavoidable. And if you are a guru, air quotes, and you're the person doing that, like how many of them just start cults, and how many of them, it winds up being sexual.
Jung was asked once to comment on psychedelic experience. I think he was asked about what Huxley was doing, and Jung's answer was, beware of unearned wisdom. Right. Very smart.
Very smart.
Very, very smart.